There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's April 1998 in the town of Elgin in northeast Scotland. A beautiful time of year where there's more sun, less rain and spring blossoms dotted around the town centre. It's a typical morning for Arlene Fraser. She's been busy getting 10-year-old Jamie and 5-year-old Natalie ready for school. She's done a load of washing, the kids have eaten their cereal and watched some cartoons, and it's time for them to make the short walk across the road to New Elgin Primary. At 8:15am, still in her dressing gown, Arlene gives them both a big kiss and a hug and waves them off down the street. She'll be here when they get home, she tells them. An hour later, while cleaning up the house, she remembers Jamie has an excursion that day, a field trip to Inverness. She realises she doesn't know the plan that afternoon. What time will they be back? Will he be able to walk home with his sister like normal? She calls the school to ask, and the receptionist tells her she'll find out and give her a call back. But when the receptionist returns Arlene's call 10 minutes later, there's no answer. 40 minutes later, a friend drops by to see her. She's not there. When Jamie and Natalie return home that afternoon, their mum is nowhere to be seen. Arlene's disappearance sparks the biggest missing person search in Scotland's history. But as her husband Nat tells police, his wife most likely ran away. Her family and friends, however, aren't convinced. The devoted mother of two would never willingly abandon her children. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Local police already knew 33-year-old Arlene Fraser's name before she disappeared. Her marriage was violent, and they'd been called in to investigate several incidents involving her husband, Nat Fraser. The most recent, 5 weeks before she vanished, nearly took her life. Her family immediately feared the worst and had their eyes set on one person. But the town struggled to see Nat as anything other than the loving family man he portrayed himself to be. Despite the enormous search, it took years to uncover the truth. As the investigation would discover, Arlene's husband didn't physically murder his wife, but he certainly planned it and orchestrated it, tormented by the independence and confidence his wife was starting to foster as their 2 young children became less dependent on her. This is a story about physical abuse, murder, coercive control, gaslighting, emotional manipulation. Even though this is a Scottish tale, it's one we're only too familiar with here in Australia. Our guest today is investigative journalist Dale Haslam, host of Vanished, the Arlene Fraser Murder podcast. Last year was the 25th anniversary of Arlene's death, prompting Dale to dive back in and piece together Arlene's story with fresh eyes. Because for her family, it isn't over. Her body has never been recovered, and they're desperate to find out where she is so that they can give her a proper goodbye. Over the last year, Dale has talked at length with Arlene's friends, family, and the police involved in her case. He joins us now. Dale, can you orient us? New Elgin, Moray in northeast Scotland. What's it like there?
So this is a part of Scotland which is very rural. You've got Aberdeen around 2 hours to the south. You've got Edinburgh around 3 hours to the southeast. And essentially Elgin is a port town. The traditional industries are fishing. A lot of people there work in the oil industry in Aberdeen traditionally, but it's very quiet. Everyone knows each other. in a nice way. It's a community and has been for decades. It's a community where people do things for each other, they're nice to each other, and people look out for each other and their families. But also, it's one where, if you like, your business is everybody's business, where if anything happens, the gossip spreads like wildfire and there isn't much secrecy around the town, if that makes sense. Ultimately, it's a nice place to live. It's somewhere where families would be happy to raise children and, people would socialize together and get on very well.
Arlene Fraser lived in Elgin with her husband and her kids. Was she a local? Who was she before she became a wife and a mum?
Her family were local to Elgin, but also had links with the Central Belt, as we call it, which is the area where Glasgow and Edinburgh is. But essentially, she was raised in Elgin. She went to school, but she left school when she was 15, 16 with not really any qualifications. And so at that point, there was a lot of pressure on her to sort of make something of herself. And she would do, a job here, a job there. She would maybe work at a shop. She worked at a fashion boutique for a while, just a local business. But Arlene was quite a straightforward, simple person. She wanted a simple life. She aspired, she wanted good things for herself, but she didn't have grand aspirations. It wasn't about being a millionaire. It was just to have a quiet family life. So as she became an adult, she would go out and socialize with her friends, and she caught the eye of a chap who was well known locally called Nat Fraser when she was out at a party one night, and she found him quite charming. He found her attractive, and she liked the fact that he'd done well for himself. He owned his own business. He was very confident, had money, wasn't rich by any stretch of the imagination, but was well off. And I think when she met Nat, she thought, I could see myself being with him because he's got a secure life and I could have a secure life with him. And another factor as well, at that time, Arlene was living with her family. She shared a room with her sister. She didn't really have her own space. And I think she sort of had dreams of, having her own house, of making her own home with a husband. And that, at that time, he fit the bill perfectly for her.
And what was Nat's reputation at that time? You said he was quite well known in Elgin in a good way?
Well, it's a great question because Nat was very much a Jekyll and Hyde character. On one hand, he painted himself as this entrepreneur. He ran his own fruit and veg delivery firm, so he would go and deliver on his round to shops, and he had a charming smile and he would be everyone's friend. And then in an evening, he played in a rock band. So he would, on weekends, go to clubs and pubs and hotels and perform with his band, and everyone loved him. But he also had a nasty side as well. He would get into fights. He would cause problems. If people crossed him, he wasn't someone to make an enemy of because he wouldn't forget and he would take revenge in certain ways. And he also, as I say, he would get into fights, and he was not averse to cheating either. On all his partners, he always cheated. So he had this split personality, really, between bad and good. But for him, his social reputation around Elgin was the most important thing in his life. How people regarded him, what they thought of him, mattered more to him than anything else.
So Arlene and Nat, they met 1985, and things happened quite quickly. They moved in together, they got married, they had a baby, all within, a few months of each other. What was the early years of their relationship like?
Well, to make the illustration, their wedding day was a great example of Nat Fraser's Jekyll and Hyde character. So on the one hand, he, had this dashing suit. He'd, forked out the money for Arlene to buy a lovely dress. He'd sent a Rolls Royce round to the house to pick her up. And, they were getting married at the Centrepiece Church in Elgin. So, that was all the good stuff. On the other hand, he turned up at the ceremony hungover. He hadn't slept. He had a big black eye because he got into a fight with someone on his stag party. And completely shocked and angered, Arlene's family. But he just thought it was a big joke, the boys will be boys type thing. And of course, at the ceremony, because Nat had to be centre of attention, he sang the music to his own first dance. And, that's the kind of person Nat was. But away from the wedding, once they'd settled down, you're right, things did happen very fast. They had a son, and then along came a daughter. And I think during that time when the children were young, Arlene settled into that role of homemaker. She was content to stay at home, look after the children, raise them, and Nat would go out and be the breadwinner on each round. And Arlene was content with that. But then as the kids got older, Arlene, she reacquainted herself with friends that she'd lost down the years because of the focus on the children. And it was having contact with those friends that inspired Arlene to sort of become more ambitious, to want to resume her education, to go back to college and maybe get a career of her own. And it was then that the friction began to arise between the two of them.
When you say friction, we're talking about domestic violence in kind of all senses of the word, not just physical. Can you paint a bit of a picture for us? What was marriage like behind the scenes for Arlene?
I think marriage behind the scenes for Arlene was very lonesome. She was in the house pretty much all the time. Her focus was the children. And meanwhile, Nat was out all hours of the day. He would say, "Oh, I'm out with a band, I'm out on business." And really, he'd be out with a different woman every night. And he would take women back to his warehouse where he stored all the goods for his company. And Arlene would find out about these affairs and she would confront him, and he would react by lashing out, and it manifested itself in different ways. It was gaslighting to a certain extent. He would call her a liar and say that she was imagining it. It became physical in the sense that he would assault her. On one occasion, he hit her in the stomach. Another occasion, he pushed her against a wall. And this violence grew worse and worse as time went on. And it really came to a head in early 1988, where Nat came in very late one night and the two of them had an argument, and Nat went to strangle Arlene with a dressing gown cord. And the injuries were really, really bad, to the point where when Arlene went to the doctors a couple of days later, she actually exhibited the injuries of a dead person. The hospital had to get a pathologist to study her face because the injuries were not the ones that a doctor had seen in a person who was alive. And, the warning signs were very, very clear at that stage that Nat's violence was getting worse and worse each time that there was conflict. It's important to say that this was 1988. This was a time before the terminology that we all use and know now, terms like gaslighting and coercion, they weren't terms that people knew at the time, that people used. And so in many respects, all the cards were stacked against Arlene because, some people might say, well, it got worse and worse. She should have saw the signs. She spent some time in a domestic violence victims centre, her and her son. And people might say, well, why didn't she get away? But everything was against her. Society judged that she should have just been a loyal wife and she should have just got on with it, and that she was just misunderstood when she thought he was cheating. Everything was stacked against her because of the social attitudes at the time.
And like you say, coercive control, I guess before you know what that term means, as it was happening to her, it was things like love bombing her back into the house, telling her she's going to be left with nothing, all of that kind of stuff, the emotional abuse that actually permeates behind the violence.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Whenever Arlene got to the point where it was the calm after the storm, where she would come back to the house, he would have a ring for her, he would have a piece of jewelry, he would have a sob story, he would make all these promises, and she would be taken in by it. And I think the reason why was because Arlene put her children above all, at the center of everything. And in her mind, if Nat was true when he said things will be different from now on, here's a ring, here's a gesture of my apology, then it would work well for the family because the children would have a settled upbringing. She considered the prospect of leaving Nat in those days, but in her mind, it was, well, I'd have to take the children out of school. I'd have to move to another part of the country. How am I going to, earn a living? When we're divorced, there will be social stigma against us, as there was at the time. And he did love bomb her. He would always say things will be different. And Arlene didn't swallow that because she was naive. It was because she truly believed that that was the best outcome for the children.
Were the police involved in a lot of these incidents you're talking about, particularly that horrific strangulation or near strangulation incident?
Yeah, the police did get involved with the strangulation incident. Initially, Arlene didn't even want to report it. She didn't want to seek medical treatment, but her friends and family said, look, your eyes are so bad. Your eyes are so bloodshot. You need to go and get treated. So it was actually the doctor who contacted the police. And the police took a statement from Arlene at that time. After she'd given a statement, again, because she had hopes of a quiet family life, she asked the police if they would remove charges against Nat, but they refused and said, look, we can't let this go. It's so serious because of the level of injury. And so Nat was actually arrested. He was charged with attempted murder at that stage. And one of the consequences of that was that Nat Fraser was banned from the family home during those proceedings. Remember, this was only 2 months before Arlene went missing. So legal proceedings can take a while, as would happen everywhere. And during those proceedings, Nat was told, you can't go near the family home. So he went to stay with a friend on a farm a few miles away and was told, you can't go near the house. And then Arlene spent a few weeks kind of with friends, with relatives, thinking about what her next step would be.
So I guess that kind of paints the picture of the context, bringing us up to the 28th of April 1998, which is the day that Arlene went missing. Her husband's living out of home. He's going through the court system, accused of attempting to murder her. What was that day like for her? Can you take us back to the beginning? It was a school day, so she would have been getting her kids ready for school.
Yeah, and this particular day was quite significant for Arlene in the routine of a week, because on a Tuesday, it was her only day of the week where she didn't have any family duties. So Tuesday was the day where she would always meet her friend for lunch. And remember, this is a time before mobile phones, so people would make weekly arrangements. They may check them on a landline, but typically they just make weekly arrangements and then turn up at each other's houses without any other way of confirming it. So on that day, Arlene woke up around 7, 8 a.m. She had to get the kids ready for school. She made them breakfast. She got them their uniforms ready. And then the kids were watching TV in the living room while Arlene went to take a load of washing out of the washing machine. She went to put the washing out on the washing line in the garden of the property, and neighbours saw her at that point. And then the kids got ready for school and she waved them off from the front doorstep. So the geography of this is very important, because people listening might think she saw them off from the doorstep. The school was literally over the road. It was a 2-minute walk in the eye line from the house. So it was very common for Arlene to be able to just kiss the kids off to school, watch them cross the road, and she would see them go into the school gates. And once that happened, once she knew that the kids had got safely to school, she went back into the house. And then effectively it was about making sure that the housework was all done. And then she would be meeting her friend Michelle for lunch, as she did every Tuesday. And then things started to go a little bit peculiar, because Arlene remembered that her son, Jamie, had a school trip that day. He was going to a city about an hour away from Elgin. And Arlene had had this mental block. She'd forgotten what the arrangements were for travel. She didn't know how her son was going to get back, whether the school was going to bring him, whether he'd be late as a result. She didn't know. So she called the school on the phone, on the landline, and she got through to the receptionist. The receptionist answered the phone and said, "I'm not really sure what the answer to your question is, but I'll ask one of my colleagues and I'll give you a call back in 10 minutes." So 10 minutes pass, and then the receptionist calls Arlene back, and there's no answer. So that was almost the start of a period of 50 minutes. We know that Arlene was clearly in the house when she made that phone call, but we don't know if she was in the house when the receptionist returned the phone call. The next thing that happened is Michelle Scott, who's Arlene's best friend, she turned up at the house as planned. They'd arranged to have lunch, and she knocked on the door, and there was no answer. The door was unlocked, so Michelle, as she would have done anyway, she let herself into the house, shouted Arlene's name, didn't get an answer. So she assumed that Arlene possibly had just called to the shop or went out somewhere momentarily. So she thought, well, I'll come back in half an hour. She did, and there was no sign of Arlene. So the period between Arlene making the call to the school and Michelle calling at the house was 50 minutes. And it was that window of time that effectively formed the crux of the investigation into where Arlene went. She's never been seen since.
When Michelle walked into that house, did she notice anything strange?
Yes, Michelle and Arlene were very close friends. They'd known each other for many years. They could tell each other anything. Michelle knew Arlene very well. And so she knew what a typical scene would be like in Arlene's house. She'd visited many times before. Arlene hadn't taken her handbag. She'd left key medication on the side. Arlene had Crohn's disease, and anyone with Crohn's disease who was planning to go somewhere for more than a couple of hours would take this medication with them, and it was there. The vacuum cleaner was plugged in, and the washing machine was on, in the sense that it had finished a load. So the washing machine was sort of set as though you would need to take the washing out of there, but you wouldn't leave it like that unless you planned to come back to it. And there were things like that around the house that indicated that Arlene had planned to leave the property for a few minutes, maybe a minute or two. A bit like if you were to collect a delivery from outside and then you were going back in. But certainly it did not indicate that she'd planned to leave for a longer period than a few minutes.
So obviously Michelle discovers that Arlene's not there. And then the next obvious thing is the kids. They come home from school, mum's not there. What happened from there? How did the cogs of Arlene's missing start to spread?
And again, it's important to remind the listeners at this point that it is 1988. It's not a time of mobile phones. Things happened in a much more routinized way there, and there was a big gulf between. When people found out things, there was a lot of assumption and a lot of, oh, maybe they're just not there, but you wouldn't be able to make a phone call to a mobile and find that out. So that's why things moved slowly. So the kids came home from school around 3:30 p.m., 4 p.m. They went to knock on the front door. There was no answer. So the children had a classmate who happened to live across the road. So they went to knock on their classmate's door and explained, oh, my mum's not home. So their classmates' parents took them in, and they didn't know what had happened. So they had the number of Arlene's dad. They called him. Have you seen Arlene? Has she said that she's going anywhere? There was a thought at that point that Arlene possibly could have gone to Inverness because she thought that her son was on a school trip there. But that was an outlying possibility. It was well, we've got no explanation and this is our best guess. But nobody knew. Around 7 o'clock, Jamie, Arlene's son, went to knock on the door again. He left a note, effectively asking Mum, where are you? Still no one there. And then around 8 p.m, so it's getting dark by now. The weather is terrible. It's a thunderstorm outside. And the people involved, so Arlene's dad, the people who'd taken in the kids, and Michelle, had all kind of spoken amongst each other and said, look, it's getting on. It's 8 o'clock. There's still no sign of Arlene. And remember that Nat Fraser wasn't allowed near the house. So there was no logical person who would be responsible for childcare at this point. And so they thought, well, look, Arlene would know that we would all be worried by now because of where are the kids going to stay tonight? Who's going to look after them? And so at that point, around 8 p.m, they decided that they would call the police. And it was at that point that this investigation began.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with investigative journalist Dale Haslam about Scotland's biggest missing person case. Next, we'll examine the investigation into Arlene Fraser's disappearance and the alibi of the police's prime suspect, Nat Fraser. You mentioned that the weather was pretty bad. So did that hamper initial search efforts? Because the first point for police is looking for her, right?
Yes and no. The police weren't theorizing on the idea that Arlene was outside somewhere. They knew that she was very much a homebody. And also they knew that she was very much a person who didn't walk anywhere. Because of her Crohn's disease, because she was only a very slight person, Arlene would never walk anywhere. Even if she was going to the corner shop, which is a few hundred yards away from the house, she would drive there. So they knew it was very unlikely that she would be outside, particularly in that weather. And at that point, the police were working on the assumption that Arlene was wherever she was voluntarily, because all they had to go on when they first looked at the house was that there was no sign of a struggle, there was no sign of forced entry, and all signs were that she'd left the property voluntarily. So at that point, the weather wasn't really a big factor in that regard, in terms of them searching fields, etc. It was more, it confirmed what they already thought about where she was likely to be in terms of inside rather than outside.
Were her family and friends worried from the very start? Obviously, she's been in a domestic violence relationship. A few weeks ago, she was strangled. That's where your mind goes straight away.
Yes, her friends and family were extremely worried from the start. The people that I interviewed, both relatives and friends, said that when they got the phone call, when they first were interviewed by detectives, they were all adamant that, first of all, something bad had happened to Arlene, that this wasn't just a drop of the hat journey somewhere or a mistake in communication. It was sinister. And that secondly, the person responsible was Nat Fraser. And the friends told me that even the previous weekend, they were talking amongst themselves, hypothesizing that Nat was going to do something bad. Because for him, during that time, when he was not allowed near the house, when he was on bail for the strangulation, they knew that Nat Fraser was fearing a loss of control and a loss of reputation. He didn't like the fact that the community was gossiping about him, the man who can't live with his family, the cheat, the person who's responsible for this vicious assault. And so Arlene's friends thought, he's not going to be able to put up with this for long. He's going to do something. So in many respects, as chilling as it sounds, for her friends and family, it probably wasn't that much of a surprise when they got that phone call from the police.
He is the obvious place to start, and you would think that this would be a clean-cut case. It wasn't. What was his story? Because he had an alibi from the start, didn't he?
Yeah. And remember I talked about this key 50-minute window that was from when Arlene was last heard of to when we knew that she was no longer at the property. During that time, Nat was working. He was in Elgin Centre with his van, delivering fruit and vegetables. And he was seen by lots of people that day, seen by colleagues, seen by customers. And interestingly, at the exact time that Arlene made the call to the school to inquire about her son's trip, Nat was on the phone too, because he'd pulled the van up to a payphone in Elgin town centre. And remember, this is a time before mobile phones, as I said earlier on. And so it was a time where the only way you could call people was by using a payphone. So Nat pulled the van up, got out of the van, and called an acquaintance he knew. And he stayed on the phone for 40 minutes. The person he was on the phone to, who's a young woman, a woman that he tried to date, shall we say, a few weeks before, she later said to the police that she was really confused by this phone call, that they had spoken on the phone before, but only for 5 minutes here or there. And that in those calls, there was always a point to it. It was always, will I see you this Saturday? Or can I come round to your house? Can I take you somewhere? There was always a point. But she told the police that when he called her from that phone box on that day, she didn't know what he was talking about. She didn't know what the point of the call was, why it took 40 minutes, and she was baffled by it. And that phone call pretty much ended at the same time that Michelle Smith came into the house and found it empty. And when police did interview Nat, their view was twofold. First of all, yes, he's got a cast iron alibi. He's on CCTV at this phone box in Elgin Centre. He's been seen by all these people. He couldn't have possibly been at the house. But the other side of that was that they thought this alibi was too good, that nobody involved ever has that clear cut of an alibi, that they happen to go to the one phone box with the only CCTV camera in the town. Detectives, they smelled a rat because they thought his alibi was just too good.
And he was a bit weird, wasn't he, when they first called him to tell him Arlene was missing?
Yeah, his friend, a very loyal friend, the one who'd allowed him to stay over during the bail proceedings, a man called Ian Taylor, he later said that Nat's behaviour at the time was really strange, and police agreed with it because Nat almost feigned shock. He said to the police along the lines of, "Oh my God, I don't know what's going on. How are the kids and where is Arlene? Have we checked the hospitals?" And the detectives thought this was weird because Nat acted on that phone call as though this was the first time he was hearing about Arlene going missing. But in actual fact, before he'd had that phone call from the police, 2 other people had called him to let him know. So those who were overhearing this conversation were baffled because they were thinking, well, he knows that she's missing. Why is he acting as though this is the first time he's heard about it? It was very peculiar indeed. And again, detectives were listening in and they were coming up with a theory about what he may have done.
Arlene's disappearance became Scotland's largest ever missing persons case at the time. Can you describe what that looked like? And was there a turning point in the investigation that led to, a next step?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that in the 48 hours after Arlene went missing, it very much changed in tone. The police went from, well, she may have just gone visiting family and fell ill somewhere, for example, with a Crohn's disease, to something's happened to her and we need to be on top of this. They printed out thousands of posters. They had a designated information line for people to call with tips. They had hundreds of volunteers searching moorlands around Elgin. They had mountain rescue units, police search dogs, mounted police officers, helicopters searching wooded areas. It was all systems go. They didn't leave any stone unturned. But the problem was that Elgin's a big area in terms of its rural surroundings. And it's horrible to say, but anybody who knows that area knows exactly where police would have looked and maybe could have been one step ahead of disposing of a body if they were that way inclined. And so it was very difficult for police to make any progress without the right kind of information from the community. But the problem was that the community in Elgin was very divided at the time. Obviously, everyone was concerned about Arlene. They wanted her to come home safe. They were worried about the children, their welfare. But a lot of people in Elgin knew Nat, and they had this rose-tinted view of him. They thought that he was just a loving husband who was misunderstood. He would never hurt Arlene. And so when the police were interviewing him, they took Nat's side. And there were stories of detectives turning up at the shop, people going up to them and saying, "Go away, why don't you go back to Aberdeen, the big city where you come from, leave us alone, we don't want you here." It really tore the community in two at that point, because people, they knew what they knew of Nat. They'd seen his band perform, they'd spoken to him in the shop, they'd seen, for example, his work van with the pictures of his two children on the side. They just saw him as a loving family man and thought he would never do anything bad. Why are the detectives giving him a hard time? We want them to go away. It was very difficult for the police in those early days.
So it took detectives not from the area coming in and sifting through the evidence again to, get this investigation moving again. What did they find changed the tone of the whole investigation?
In many respects, in the early days, although it might sound an odd thing to say, but the police were hampered by too many tips. They were getting hundreds and hundreds of witness statements, of calls, and many of them were very well intentioned, but they were red herrings. They were taking police in the wrong direction. For example, one person called and said, "Oh, I think there was a car which I crushed at my crushing yard," and police spent a long time investigating that, but it turned out to be a red herring. And so it was almost a case of a needle in a haystack. And the first group of detectives, who spent maybe 3 months on the case, got a bit jaded. They couldn't find this silver bullet to progress the investigation. So, as you say, the police in Aberdeen, they decided to shake it up a bit. They brought in a new group of detectives who were known as the A-Team because they had a good clear-up rate at the time. And the A-Team were assigned to this case, and they were told, pretend you don't know anything about it, go through all the evidence forensically, every scrap of information, every call, every last tip, see if you can find something. And it was at that point that they got this breakthrough. What happened was, a couple of months earlier, so about 2 months after Arlene had gone missing, a man had made a call to the police and said, "I've got some important information for you." He said, "I was in the pub last night. I was on my own, having a beer, minding my own business. And there were two people on the table next to me, and they were talking about a car." And what it was that sparked this person's interest was that they mentioned Arlene's name, and they mentioned a sale of this particular car on the very day before Arlene went missing. So this person had called the police with his tip-off, but it had gone unanswered for months. And then the A-Team came in, they picked up on it, and in their mind it was, this is it, this is the tip that we've been waiting for. And it really did turn the investigation on its head.
Did the person who phoned in the tip identify the people he overheard talking about the car?
No, these were two people who were not directly involved in the case at the time. They were two people who'd been asked to effectively facilitate the sale of a car 2 days earlier on by a friend of Nat. So the person who called the police basically said, look, these guys are involved. They're not the main people involved, but you need to go around and see them. Now, police were able to deduce that one of the people mentioned in the conversation was a guy called Kevin Ritchie. Kevin Ritchie was a mechanic in Elgin at the time. He would fix cars, but he would also buy and sell them. And the police determined that a couple of days before Arlene went missing, a man called Hector Dick had contacted Kevin and said, can you get me a car? I'm after a cheap run around, something that won't cost much, but will do a good job for a ride around town. And Kevin said, yeah, okay, no problem. So Kevin went to Hector Dick's farm to negotiate the sale of this car. And during that conversation at Hector Dick's farm, Nat Fraser was in the room. And it was that gave police their breakthrough. They were able to arrest Kevin Ritchie. They were able to arrest Hector Dick and basically see what was said and see how this car was involved in the disappearance of Arlene Fraser.
At this point, were police starting to form a theory as to what they thought might have happened to Arlene?
Yeah, police were keeping an open mind, but one crucial detail that was on their minds at the time was that a couple of weeks before Arlene went missing, something really strange and sinister happened at Arlene's house. Arlene was sleeping, it was around midnight. At the time, Arlene's mother was staying at the house. And they both woke up around midnight, 1 a.m., and they looked out the front window to see the family car up in flames, on fire. No explanation. Crazy thing to happen in a quiet suburban street in Elgin. The fire brigade came out, they put the fire out, but the car was destroyed. So for 2 weeks before she went missing, Arlene had no car. And remember, as I said earlier on, she was very much car dependent and the police knew that. The police's hypothesis was that Nat, the love bomber, may have contacted Arlene and said, look, it was a real shame what happened to your car a couple of weeks ago. You're going to need a new one. How about I get you one? I know someone who can get you a car. I'll get one of my friends to bring it round. So the police, their best guess at the time was that Nat had arranged for somebody to deliver this car, which was a Ford, and take it to Arlene's house, and that Arlene would leave the house for a few minutes, have a look at the car, maybe take it round the block, and then it would be hers. And that this is what happened on the day Arlene went missing. It was possible that Arlene left the house voluntarily, thinking that she would only be out of the house for a minute or two. She got into that car, thinking that it would just be a quick spin around the block to hear how the engines sound and see how it drives. But she was ultimately taken to a disposal site and killed and buried. But there was still no body and there was no crime scene. So all that police had to go on at the time was the interviews, and they really did start to turn the screw on Kevin Ritchie and Hector Dick.
So did they try and lure Hector into telling them more? What did that kind of operation look like?
Yeah, Hector Dick was a funny character. He'd been in trouble with the police before, but not in a major way. But he was very suspicious of the police. And the detectives we interviewed even told us that he had a sticker on his landline which said, think before you speak. So he was very much aware of the pitfalls of saying too much and incriminating yourself. So when, on the many occasions, the detectives did interview Hector Dick, he knew his way around it. He would play for time. He wouldn't admit things. So the police needed another way of getting Hector to talk. So what they did, they persuaded Kevin Ritchie to go to a military base on the outskirts of Elgin. He was briefed effectively by the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and the police put a wire in his car and on his body as well. And they persuaded Kevin Ritchie to arrange to meet Hector Dick in a set of woods nearby. And they said to Kevin, look, all we want you to do is get him to talk about Arlene. And he did. And it was at that point that Hector first spoke about his involvement with the disappearance of Arlene. He said words to the effect of, the police don't know anything, Kevin, you need to keep your mouth shut. If they don't know anything, they can't arrest us. And it was at that point that the police knew that Hector was involved, because he'd facilitated the purchase of this car, and that Kevin was involved, albeit less seriously, but more to the point, Nat Fraser was involved.
It's still not a lot of information though, is it? So meanwhile, Nat, he gets charged in 1999 with assaulting and attempting to murder his wife, not from the disappearance, from the incident that we've spoken about a few weeks prior, the strangulation. Was that part of their process, trying to put him behind bars, kind of shake him out a bit, see if they can get more information out of him? Obviously, it was a genuine charge as well. But what was the tactic behind all of that? And did it work?
The police and the Crown Office would have prosecuted him anyway for that. Even if Arlene hadn't have gone missing, Nat still would have been prosecuted for the attempted murder. It was more the case of the fact that when he was jailed for that, he came out of prison, but he went back to prison. And again, this is a sign of the kind of man that Nat Fraser was in terms of his Jekyll and Hyde character. He was telling people around Elgin that he was innocent and misunderstood, and the police were just victimizing him. But on the other hand, during the original court case, Nat claimed that he had no money, and so as a result was given legal aid. So the taxpayer paid for his defense lawyer, essentially. And it turned out that he had lots of money because he owned his own business and his house. So he was prosecuted for legal aid fraud and then put back into prison. So again, an insight into his character. But those two spells in prison gave the police an opportunity to keep an eye on him, to see what he said. And he had a couple of people who would visit him regularly. And the police benefited because they were able to see who Nat was meeting with and what was being said. And to quote one detective, they were looking at these informal chats during prison visits, and they said it was clear that they weren't talking about football. They were talking about something more sinister. But the problem that the police had, they knew that these conversations were potentially very, very useful to finding out whether Nat had a hand in doing something sinister to Arlene. But there was no audio. There was just video. It was just two men sat across from each other, gesticulating, looking very stern and serious. The detectives were really intrigued by these videos, but they couldn't figure out what was being said. So they turned to who was at the time the UK's most prolific lip reader, a woman who had put away some of the biggest criminals in British legal history, a woman called Jessica Rees. She was profoundly deaf herself. She was a very, very highly thought of lip reader. So they went down to England, they took these tapes and said, Jessica, look, we're really needing to find a breakthrough. Please have a look at these tapes and see if you can tell us what Nat's saying to his friend.
The friend you mentioned, a man named Glenn Lucas, she did translate what the two of them were talking about, and it was pretty damning. What did she say that they said?
It was really interesting how this interpretation from Jessica Rees changed everything. Because at the time, you still had half of the people in Elgin who were in favour of Nat. They were, oh, he's misunderstood. The police are just out to get him because he's the husband. But he didn't do it. I know Nat's a nice guy. But what Jessica said after watching these tapes changed that perception. Nat, in Jessica's professional opinion, was said to have commented on Arlene in very graphic terms. He talked about the police not being able to find the body because the body didn't exist anymore, that arms and legs had been torn off, and that the body was in bits and that teeth had been grinded down. Really horrific detail. And as awful and distressing as those comments were, for the police, it was the first sign that Nat Fraser had had involvement in the murder and disposal of Arlene Fraser. And the key thing to mention is they still believe that Nat Fraser's alibi was strong. They still believe that he wasn't physically there. But, under UK law, Scottish law, you don't need to physically be a participant in someone's murder. If you're a conspirator, if you're the person that, if you like, presses the button that sends out the instruction, you're as guilty as the person whose hand carried out the deed itself. And so at that point, the detectives moved in and they charged Nat Fraser with Arlene's murder.
At the same time, they also charged Glenn Lucas and Hector Dick, didn't they? So we've kind of painted half the picture, but they think that Nat pressed the button and orchestrated it. Hector, we've talked about, was involved in the car and potentially abducting Arlene. So is it Glenn that is the hit guy?
Well, there was never anything serious about that. The police and the Crown Office were merely casting their net far and wide, so to speak. Their view was, look, we've got these three guys, we can charge them. Doesn't necessarily have to amount to anything, but while they're charged, they're in custody, they can't speak with each other, and we've got them there to question if we wish. And what happened was, on the first day of the court hearing, when all three of them were due to be prosecuted and stand trial, the Crown Office and the detectives made quite a strong decision to basically dismiss the charges against everybody except Nat Fraser. And the way that the detectives put it to me was they'd rather have a good chance of prosecuting one person than a fair chance of prosecuting three. They were aiming their crosshairs at the main person, who was Nat Fraser. So it was only Nat Fraser who stood trial.
Does that mean the other two helped police because they were getting a free pass?
Essentially, yes. One of them, Hector Dick, as we say at the time, he turned Queen's evidence, which means going from the person in the firing line to the person helping the police. So Hector effectively, during the trial, gave evidence for the prosecution. And what he said was quite damning towards Nat, because he'd said, I was hanging around with Nat a lot in the days before Arlene went missing, and he was saying some crazy things. He was talking about the concept of no-body disappearances. Hector claimed that Nat was obsessed with this concept of no-body disappearances, the idea that only a few people a year go missing in Scotland and the UK, and their bodies are never found. And at least according to Hector, Nat was obsessed with the idea that, well, if the police have got no body, there's no way that they could prosecute. And Hector went as far as to say that Nat had gone into the library and got books out to research this concept of no-body disappearances, and that was almost obsessed with the idea. And on one occasion during the trial, the prosecutor said, well, what did you make of that? Did you think that it was just a fascination with criminal history, or did you think that it had anything to do with Arlene? And, Hector was sure that it was to do with Arlene. And it was pretty much that which convinced the jury. And when the verdict came back, they came up with a guilty plea, and Nat Fraser went to jail for the murder of his wife.
Yeah, so Nat was jailed for 25 years. But if we skip forward to 2006, he was suddenly released from prison many, many, many years early. Why?
It might sound quite shocking to anyone listening to that, but actually it was a sort of collapse of the case in a steady way. It all went wrong because of many different exposures of the original investigation that the police did in Arlene's murder and her disappearance. One of the things that they got wrong was related to the lip reader that I mentioned earlier on, Jessica Rees. There'd been separate journalist investigations into Jessica Rees's work, and it turned out that when other lip readers did the same assessments on videotapes with no audio that Jessica had done, they came up with much different results. And it turned out that Jessica wasn't as good as she'd led people to believe. She lied about having a qualification in lip reading. She didn't have the standing that she'd led people to believe that she had. And essentially, she wasn't a very good lip reader. She was good in everyday life, but not in terms of the standards expected by a court of law to prove that someone is 100% guilty. And so the evidence that Jessica had brought forward, the tapes with Nat talking about grinding up teeth, etc., was null and void all of a sudden. And then there were other things related to Hector Dick's reliability, but also during the trial, the police had sought to claim that Arlene's 3 rings, the ring that she'd been given by Nat for an engagement and for her wedding, and then an apology ring, if I can put it that way, had been left on the side of the sink. And the prosecution had claimed that Arlene had left them there as a symbol that the relationship was over and that she was choosing to go away somewhere. She was choosing to leave her family and to start a new life somewhere. And the prosecution said that that was Nat's doing, that Nat had come back into the house after the investigation began. I remember he was the dad of the kids, so he had every reason to be there at that point once the house had been cleared for crime scene investigations. The detectives argued that Nat had effectively taken the rings from the body, put them in the bathroom, and then told the police, oh, well, that's Arlene's way of saying that she's left forever. And the jury bought that. But rather conspicuously, what happened was it turned out that these rings had never been missing at all. They were spotted on video that the police had seen in the house a few hours after Arlene went missing. And then they went missing. And then they came back. And Nat had nothing to do with it, or at least in evidential terms. So there was a massive doubt over the rings, a massive doubt over the lip reader, and a massive doubt over Hector Dick's testimony. And all those 3 things combined meant that there was just no way that that conviction was safe. And so Nat's legal team appealed many times to many courts. And at one point, before his appeal succeeded, they let him go into Elgin. They thought it was unfair that he was in prison when there was evidence that his conviction was unsafe. So he was allowed back into the community.
There was a second trial in 2012 and he was again found guilty. What happened there?
Yeah, and at this point, it was important after the original conviction was found unsafe that the detectives and the Crown Office stood by Arlene's family. They were distraught by Nat being back on the streets. And what they didn't want was that to be the end of the story. At the time, there was a law in place in Scotland called double jeopardy, which meant that you can't be tried for the same crime twice. And there was a really important legal change around about, I think, 2011, where that was quashed. So if new evidence was found, suddenly a case could be brought against the same person twice. And so what happened was the detectives looked at the case again. They put all the evidence forward, and the Crown prepared the file, and they got one of the, if not the, top prosecutors in the country, a man called Alex Prentice, King's Counsel, who took on the case and put Nat back on the stand. And, that was a real fierce encounter with Nat claiming to be the loving husband who was misunderstood, and Alex Prentice going through the evidence very methodically. And it was very tense for the family. They'd been in court before, but they just didn't know how this was going to go. And it was an outcome which was really, really up in the air until the very last moment.
I can only imagine what that must have felt like then, to actually get the guilty back after so many years of court processes. He was given a minimum of 17 years in that second trial. So 2029 is his earliest parole, when he'd been in his 70s or so. We're in 2024 now. Nat's in prison. Arlene's body, has it ever been found?
No, sadly, there's never really been any clearly defined burial site. The police, and again, the detectives that I've spoken to have been quite candid about this. Every time the slightest bit of information has come forward from someone connected with Nat or others, they've gone there. I mean, they've gone to remote Scottish islands to dig up pieces of land. They've done everything. They've used modern technology to get to the bottom of it, but it's just not happened. They see this as a case whereby, if new information came to light, they would absolutely put resources into looking at potential burial sites. Regretfully, though, with the passage of time, 25 years on, it's one of those where, as time goes on, the chances of finding that burial site are fading unless the one man who knows where it is tells police where it is.
I guess this brings us to the point of, we're 5 years away from Nat being able to apply for parole, but he hasn't told police where the body is. Is that the kind of tension we're at now? Are the family still fighting for him to remain behind bars until there's a body? What's the situation there?
Yeah, there's currently a campaign in Scotland for the introduction of something called Suzanne's Law. And essentially what that would be is, if someone's in prison at the moment for murder and the burial site or the position of the body has never been revealed, that person can never be released unless they say where that body is. And that is something that Arlene's family are very much campaigning for to politicians in London, in Edinburgh, but it's only been partially implemented. So what happens at the moment, and this is very recent, this was only 2023 where this legal change was made, and to the credit of the Scottish government, at the moment, when there is a parole hearing, the parole board has to take into account whether a convicted murderer has identified a burial spot. But it doesn't have to be a prerequisite. And it's that legal change that the family want the Scottish government to bring in. But the Scottish government says that they can't do it because it's not in tune with European rights. So the European Human Rights Convention talks about people's right to a family life, ironically enough, and essentially that Nat could, in theory, if a parole board denied him a release that another prisoner might get, that he could then go to the European Court of Human Rights and get that overturned. So it's a real battle at the moment for Arlene's family. They want to persuade the Scottish government to implement that change, but it's something that they've not managed to do so far.
It's so interesting because we're all just having the same fight in different countries. Here in Australia, we're doing the same thing. That whole no body, no parole conversation is something we have had numerous times here as well. In particular, the case of Lynette Dawson, which most, if not all, Australians would know. So it seems everywhere we're tackling and trying to evolve our court systems to better represent what victims and survivors and families want.
Yeah, it's a very good point. But in this particular case, it does give you a glimpse into Nat Fraser's mindset, because for him, the position of the body is the last bit of power that he holds over Arlene's family. And, let's not forget as well that the two children, they're adults now. And he knows that if he reveals the location of the body, that will confirm what everybody knows. The court and the jury, the impartial jury, concluded that he killed their mother. And he knows that that would be really bad for his reputation. But, like you say, he's an old man now. He's in his 70s. The question is, when he is released from prison, whether that's 2029 or afterwards, will he go back to Elgin? Will he admit what he's done and tell police where Arlene was buried? What will be his moral decisions? And I think everybody in a few years' time will be looking out to see what he decides to do.
For me, apart from the obvious things that are horribly sad about this story, the children, the fact that Arlene's body has never been found, the fact that she died in the first place. But what really saddens me looking back at this story is how the same it is now in terms of domestic violence, relationships, coercive control, the fact that women try to leave over and over and over again and that they can't, and that they feel this control from society and then they can't go to the police. It's all the same. And we're 25 years later. Is there anything that's stuck with you after looking at this case?
While I would say I fundamentally agree with you, and it's frustrating because we cover court and we see what happens in court every day, I think some developments are good in the sense of police routinely wear body-worn cameras now. They're trained in coercion and gaslighting. So if they go to a breach of the peace house call, for example, they're trained to spot the signs of coercion, even if that wasn't the reason for the call to the address. So there are these minor changes, but sadly, yeah, some of the things that happened back then are still happening now. And all we can say, as a team of journalists is that we are very indebted to the families of people like Arlene Fraser who have told their story in an effort to almost tell other victims to reach out, to know that there are support services there, that you will be believed, you will get the support you need if you reach out and take that step. And all we can do as a media outlet is to share those stories, but we are very grateful to Arlene's family and other families for sharing their stories to send that message out.
Thanks to Dale for assisting us to tell this story. You can hear Dale's full investigation of Arlene's case, including first-hand interviews with Arlene's friends and detectives who worked on the case, in his podcast Vanished, the Arlene Fraser Murder. You'll find it linked in our episode description. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast, hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another true crime conversation.